The year was 1941, a year that shattered illusions and ignited the furnace of history. The world was already at war, devouring itself in smoke and steel, when the United States finally entered the conflict after the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Overnight, a nation built on industry, innovation, and optimism turned itself into an unstoppable engine of war. Every man, woman, and machine was enlisted into the fight. Assembly lines began producing tanks instead of cars, bombers instead of passenger planes, and uniforms instead of suits. Yet amid the thunder of artillery and the endless grind of production, there was something invisible but just as vital to victory: the morale of the American soldier. While generals planned campaigns and factories forged weapons, one man, Robert Woodruff, the president of the Coca-Cola Company, saw a different kind of battle being fought. He understood that the war was not only about defeating the enemy, it was about preserving the human spirit of those sent to fight. Woodruff made a simple declaration, one that would resonate through every battlefield and base camp from Normandy to the Pacific. Every man in uniform should be able to get a Coke for 5 cents, wherever he is and whatever it costs the company. It was not a marketing slogan. It was a promise, a patriotic oath disguised as a business decision. That single statement transformed Coca-Cola from a popular American beverage into an instrument of morale, a symbol of home that would travel farther and endure longer than any other product in modern history. For millions of young Americans shipping off to fight in Europe, Africa, and Asia, Coca-Cola was more than a drink. It was a piece of home they could hold in their hands, something familiar in a world that had suddenly become foreign and hostile. To those boys, farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, and students from New York, the sight of that curved glass bottle, cold and sweating with condensation, was a reminder of life before the war. It was the sound of laughter in diners, baseball games on summer afternoons, the clink of bottles shared with friends at a soda fountain. It was America itself, bottled and carbonated. When the United States declared war, the Coca-Cola Company faced a monumental decision. It could have chosen to protect its domestic market, preserving resources and profits. Instead, it mobilized like a military division. Factories adapted, engineers trained, and distribution networks were redesigned to serve the armed forces. The U.S. government quickly recognized the potential of Coca-Cola's contribution. Sugar was heavily rationed, yet the drink was granted special exemption. Coca-Cola was officially classified as an essential war commodity, not because it nourished the body, but because it nourished the soul. The company began training special personnel, men known as technical observers. They weren't soldiers, but they wore khaki uniforms, carried military identification, and operated under the same risks as the troops. Their mission was unconventional yet crucial: to build and maintain Coca-Cola bottling plants wherever the U.S. Army established bases. They traveled alongside soldiers, through deserts and jungles, through bombed-out towns and remote islands. Their goal was simple: to ensure that, no matter how far from home a soldier found himself, he could still open a bottle of Coca-Cola and taste America. In 1942, when U.S. forces launched Operation Torch, the first major American offensive in the European theater, Coca-Cola was there. Within months, the company established its first overseas bottling plant in Oran, Algeria. Amid the chaos of war, machinery was unpacked, glass molds were set, and within days, the first bottles rolled off the line. Soldiers who had spent weeks fighting under the relentless desert sun lined up for their ration, and when they took that first cold sip, something changed in the air. The laughter returned, if only for a moment. The world beyond the battlefield, the world of jukeboxes, movie theaters, and lazy summer evenings didn't feel so far away anymore. To the men who fought, that bottle was more than refreshment. It was salvation. They passed bottles around campfires, toasted victories, and even shared them with captured enemies and local villagers. In their letters home, many soldiers mentioned Coca-Cola as fondly as they mentioned letters from loved ones. One private in the 3rd Infantry Division wrote, "It's strange how a drink can make you feel human again. You open that bottle, hear the hiss, take a sip, and for a second, you're not in North Africa. You're back home." But Coca-Cola's contribution was not only psychological, it was logistical. As the war expanded, so did Coca-Cola's operations. New bottling plants sprang up wherever U.S. forces advanced, from Algiers to Sicily, from Italy to France, and eventually deep into the Pacific Islands. Each plant was designed to operate in extreme conditions, producing tens of thousands of bottles per day. Supplies were often scarce, glass had to be recycled, and ingredients were rationed. Yet the technical observers improvised like soldiers. They used salvaged equipment, repaired machinery under fire, and found ways to keep production going no matter the obstacle. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself recognized the power of Coca-Cola. When he saw how much morale it brought to the troops, he issued an order to ensure that Coke followed the army wherever it went. He understood that wars are not won by machines alone, but by men, and men need reminders of what they fight for. In one of his wartime communications, Eisenhower referred to Coca-Cola as a symbol of home, something that should be available to every man in uniform. That order became the foundation for a massive global network of Coke bottling plants, 64 in total by the end of the war. These plants became as essential as ammunition depots or fuel dumps. Army convoys carried Coke syrup alongside rations and medicine. Refrigerated trucks, rare luxuries on the battlefield, were often reserved just to keep Coke cold for the troops. Some generals even joked that the U.S. Army had 3 primary supply lines: food, ammunition, and Coca-Cola. But the company's motives were not cynical. Woodruff and his executives did not see the war as a marketing opportunity. They saw it as a duty. Coca-Cola had always represented American values: optimism, simplicity, and joy. In the midst of a world drowning in destruction, those values mattered more than ever. Every bottle shipped overseas was a message: we haven't forgotten you. America hasn't forgotten you. The company's advertising during the war reflected this spirit. Instead of pushing sales, it promoted unity and patriotism. Posters showed smiling soldiers sharing Cokes under palm trees, or nurses handing bottles to wounded men. The slogans read, "Have a Coke equals have a Coke with a soldier," and "Yes, Coca-Cola goes along." For millions of Americans on the home front, Coca-Cola became a way to participate in the war effort, every sip a gesture of solidarity with the troops abroad. By the end of 1943, Coca-Cola had become an integral part of military life. It was in every mess hall, every supply depot, every rest camp. Soldiers didn't just drink it, they celebrated it. The clinking of Coke bottles became the sound of temporary peace, a moment of humanity amidst the noise of war. And though the battles raged on across continents, the idea behind every bottle remained the same. Home was never as far away as it seemed. When the sun set over the deserts of North Africa and the air cooled after another day of chaos, soldiers would gather, pass around bottles of Coca-Cola, and talk about home. They'd joke about their mother's cooking, their girls waiting back in the States, the baseball games they'd missed. The taste of Coke, sweet, fizzy, and familiar, pulled them all back to those memories. For a few minutes, in the glow of a campfire and the sparkle of glass, they were no longer warriors in a foreign land. They were just Americans again. And that, perhaps, was Coca-Cola's greatest victory. Not on any battlefield, but in the hearts of men who needed to remember what they were fighting for. The war would test their strength, courage, and endurance. But through it all, one small bottle reminded them that even in the darkest times, the spirit of home could travel anywhere, even to the ends of the earth. Coca-Cola wasn't just a drink. It was a lifeline, a promise, and an unspoken bond between a nation and its sons at war. In a world that had lost its innocence, Coca-Cola became the quiet whisper of America's enduring soul, a taste of hope that refused to fade, even in the shadow of global destruction. By 1943, the Coca-Cola Company had become something far more than a beverage producer. It had become a logistical division of the U.S. Army in all but name. From the deserts of North Africa to the steaming jungles of the South Pacific, the company's mission was now aligned with the pulse of the Allied war machine. To a soldier at the front, a Coca-Cola bottle was not a luxury, it was a lifeline. The first bottling plant overseas, the one in Oran, Algeria, was only the beginning. It was a feat of improvisation and daring, constructed amid the chaos of war. Engineers unloaded crates of glass bottles under the threat of air raids, built makeshift assembly lines out of salvaged parts, and purified water in tin drums scavenged from army dumps. The machinery rattled and groaned under the desert sun, yet somehow it worked. When that first batch of cold, fizzy Coca-Cola poured into the green glass bottles, men cheered. Some laughed, others simply stared. In a place where sand and sweat defined every day, that sound of carbonation was like a hymn. Soon, bottling plants sprang up across the Allied front lines like outposts of morale. From North Africa, the operation expanded to Sicily and Italy, following the path of Eisenhower's troops. In each new location, the technical observers, the specially trained Coca-Cola men, set up shop in the ruins of old factories, in tents, or even in open fields. They became legends among the troops. These men wore khaki, lived under shell fire, and faced the same dangers as the soldiers they served, but their weapons were wrenches, compressors, and hoses. The troops began to call them the Coke Commandos. Each new plant had to overcome impossible obstacles. Supplies were short, roads were bombed, and spare parts were almost non-existent. But the Coke Commandos were relentless. When bottles ran out, they collected empties from the front lines, washing and refilling them by hand. When refrigeration units broke, they scavenged copper tubing from wrecked vehicles to repair them. When glass shattered under artillery shock waves, they melted down shards to forge new molds. It was not just production, it was ingenuity under fire. Coca-Cola had become a symbol of endurance itself. Soldiers would line up in the blazing heat or in the pouring rain, helmets in hand, waiting for their ration. The Coke Day, the day when a shipment arrived, became as anticipated as mail from home. A soldier might not have eaten in 2 days or slept in a week, but when he heard that hiss of the bottle cap being pried off, for a few seconds the world felt right again. General Dwight D. Eisenhower himself saw the magic that Coke carried. In his orders to the Quartermaster Corps, he explicitly called for Coca-Cola to be made available to every man in uniform wherever he was stationed. It was, as one officer wrote, a tonic for the soul. Eisenhower recognized that morale could win wars just as surely as tanks and bombers. When troops marched into a new campaign, he ensured that, along with ammunition, food, and fuel, they would also receive shipments of Coca-Cola syrup and bottling equipment. And so, along the convoys of jeeps and half-tracks, there came an unlikely companion, the Coke trucks. Their sides bore the red and white insignia, and inside were crates stacked with shimmering bottles. Soldiers joked that even if the army ran out of ammunition, they'd never run out of Coke. These convoys moved through Europe and the Pacific, dodging bullets and bomb craters, carrying liquid morale wherever it was needed most. In the Italian campaign, when Allied forces fought through the mountains of Cassino and the mud of Anzio, Coca-Cola was there. A soldier might emerge from days of combat, grime covering his face, his uniform torn and blood-stained, and at the rest camp he'd find an ice chest full of Coke bottles. The first cold swallow washed away exhaustion. It reminded him that somewhere far beyond the smoke and rubble there was still civilization. It reminded him that America still existed. The same America that once seemed impossibly distant now lived in that familiar taste. In the Pacific, Coca-Cola faced even greater challenges. The heat spoiled supplies, humidity corroded machinery, and shipping lines were constantly under threat from Japanese submarines. Yet somehow, the Coke Commandos adapted again. They built compact, mobile bottling plants that could fit into transport planes or ships, allowing production to move with the front line. On islands like Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and later the Philippines, Coke became part of daily life. It was served in mess tents, at airstrips, and aboard Navy vessels. Marines who stormed beaches and pilots who flew bombing runs all shared the same ritual, the cold comfort of a Coke when the battle was done. But beyond the soldiers, Coca-Cola became an ambassador. The locals in war-torn regions saw the drink for the first time. In dusty North African towns, children would gather around the soldiers to share sips. In Italian villages liberated by the Allies, Coke bottles were passed around like treasures. The drink became synonymous with the Americans themselves, strong, generous, and full of life. The Coca-Cola Company never advertised this part of the story during the war. There were no flashy posters or grand announcements of their efforts. Their motto was simple: "We go where you go." It was more than a slogan. It was a silent vow to follow the American soldier wherever he marched. The results were astonishing. By 1944, there were 32 bottling plants operating in the European and Pacific theaters, with more under construction. Each one was capable of producing thousands of bottles a day. By the end of the war, the total would reach over 5 billion bottles delivered to the troops. 5 billion reminders of home. For the soldiers, Coca-Cola became part of their identity. They painted Coke logos on their trucks and bombers, named foxholes in dugouts after the drink, and even used the bottles in improvised ways, as grenades, candle holders, or makeshift canteens. In every Army photograph, somewhere in the background, you could find that familiar bottle, proof that no matter how far from home they were, a piece of America had followed them. The impact of Coca-Cola's wartime mission rippled far beyond the battlefield. It taught the company how to operate under pressure, how to move fast, adapt, and build global infrastructure on the fly. But more importantly, it showed the world, both friend and foe, what America truly valued. Not just victory, but the preservation of spirit, comfort, and life itself. When the Allied armies pushed north through Italy, liberated Paris, and began their march toward Germany, Coca-Cola's bottling plants followed close behind. As towns were freed from Nazi occupation, the first signs of normal life often appeared in the form of a Coke truck rolling down the street, handing out bottles to cheering civilians and exhausted soldiers alike. It wasn't propaganda. It was something purer. In a war defined by destruction, Coca-Cola represented creation. It created joy where there was despair, familiarity where there was foreignness, and humanity where there was chaos. For a soldier standing knee-deep in mud, holding that cold, sweating bottle in his hand, the world, just for a moment, made sense again. And so, the story of Coca-Cola in World War II became inseparable from the story of the American fighting man himself. Wherever he went, the drink followed, a constant companion, a reminder of the land he came from, and a promise of the world he hoped to return to. In foxholes and barracks, on ships and airfields, amidst fire and fear, one thing remained steady: the sound of a cap being popped, the fizz rising, and the quiet moment of peace that followed. In a war that demanded everything from those who fought it, Coca-Cola gave something back. Something that could not be measured in calories or cost, but in memory and meaning. It was not merely a drink. It was a symbol of hope in a bottle. And for the men on the front lines, that was worth more than gold. By the summer of 1944, the world stood on the precipice of change. The Allied invasion of Europe had begun, and with it came a wave of momentum that would roll inexorably across the continent. Amidst the thunder of artillery, the roar of tanks, and the crack of rifles, there existed another kind of sound, a quiet fizz, a pop of a bottle cap, a sound of home. It was faint, drowned out by the chaos of war, but to the soldiers who heard it, it was a reminder of everything they were fighting for. As the Allied troops pushed inland from the beaches of Normandy, crates marked with the unmistakable Coca-Cola logo began to appear behind the front lines. They arrived alongside ammunition and rations, loaded on the same convoys that carried fuel and blood plasma. To the logistics officers of the U.S. Army, it was more than just a soft drink, it was morale in a bottle. And to the men who had been months, sometimes years, without a taste of home, it was liquid nostalgia. In liberated French villages, people gathered in wonder around these American soldiers who carried not only weapons, but bottles of a mysterious brown beverage. For many Europeans, this was their first encounter with Coca-Cola. To them, it wasn't just a drink, it was a symbol of freedom. French farmers would trade eggs or bread for a single bottle. Children would follow the trucks, hoping to find discarded caps or empty glass souvenirs. The red script logo gleamed like an emblem of a new world, one that promised abundance, hope, and something lighter than the gray weight of occupation. Coca-Cola's bottling plants had now spread far beyond the American mainland. In Italy, France, Belgium, and even into the shattered cities of Germany, makeshift factories were built from salvaged materials, staffed by locals who quickly learned the trade. Some of these workers had seen their towns reduced to rubble only months before. Now, they found themselves mixing syrup, washing bottles, and filling crates under the watchful supervision of men in khaki uniforms. Each bottle that rolled off the line was destined for the front, for a weary soldier, for a taste of home carried across oceans and battlefields. The U.S. Army brass understood the value of morale better than any army before them. General Eisenhower himself had approved Coca-Cola's operations, recognizing how a familiar comfort could keep his men human amidst the horrors of war. The Coca-Cola Company had effectively become an auxiliary branch of the American war machine, not by design of politics, but by necessity of spirit. Every bottle cap popped open in a trench, every toast shared in a muddy field, was another reason to keep moving forward, to fight a little longer. There were stories whispered through the ranks about Coca-Cola men who had gone further than any civilian should. In the ruins of Monte Cassino, one bottler reportedly stayed behind after an air raid to save the filling equipment, claiming that as long as this runs, the boys don't forget home. In the Ardennes, during the bitter winter of 1944, drivers risked enemy fire to deliver crates to isolated units. The soldiers joked that Coca-Cola was invincible. It never froze, it never broke, and somehow it always found them, even in hell. In newly liberated Paris, an American GI named Private William Red Halverson wrote home about his experience. "Ma, it's crazy out here. They gave us a Coke today, our first one since Sicily. I swear, I never knew a drink could make a man feel so proud. You see that red label, and you remember the 4th of July, the ball games, the streets back home. It's like taking a gulp of America itself." But behind this symbol of joy was a machine of efficiency unlike any other corporate wartime effort. Coca-Cola's president, Robert Woodruff, had pledged that every man in uniform would have access to a bottle of Coke for 5 cents, wherever he might be. That meant navigating bombed-out rail lines, shattered ports, and supply routes that snaked through hostile territory. Engineers, chemists, and logisticians became unsung heroes of the front, ensuring that bottling plants could operate with limited resources and near constant danger. When American troops entered Germany in 1945, Coca-Cola followed closely behind. It was there, in the heart of a broken Reich, that the company made one of its most unusual discoveries, a small plant in Essen that had survived the bombings. During the war, cut off from American syrup supplies, German bottlers had created their own substitute, a drink made from leftover apple fiber and whey. They called it Fanta. What began as a desperate improvisation under wartime scarcity would later become one of Coca-Cola's most successful products in peacetime. Even amid the darkness, innovation had found a way to survive. By the time the war ended, Coca-Cola had established 64 bottling plants across Europe and the Pacific. The brand had become so entwined with the image of the American soldier that, in many places, the two were inseparable. To drink Coca-Cola was to experience a piece of America. The music, the optimism, the swagger of a nation that had crossed oceans not only to fight, but to liberate. When the guns finally fell silent, the Coca-Cola trucks didn't stop. They rolled through the rubble of Europe, distributing not just beverages, but a message of reconstruction. American troops left behind the infrastructure, the bottling machines, the recipes, and the craving for that taste of freedom. In towns once scarred by war, Coca-Cola signs began to appear on cafes and street corners. To a world emerging from tyranny, the sight of that red and white logo meant more than refreshment, it meant recovery. As peace settled uneasily over the continents, Coca-Cola's role shifted from soldier to diplomat. The same bottles that had traveled through blood and fire now passed hands in boardrooms and embassies. For millions of civilians, their first sip of Coca-Cola wasn't just about flavor. It was a symbolic handshake with America, a taste of the culture that had triumphed through sacrifice. In that transition from war to peace, Coca-Cola didn't merely sell a drink. It sold a feeling, a promise that life could be sweet again. For the soldiers who returned home, each bottle was a reminder of the comrades they'd lost and the world they'd helped save. For the nations they liberated, it was a quiet testament that from destruction, something bright, familiar, and human could rise once more. When history remembers the great weapons of World War II, the tanks, the bombers, the rifles, it often forgets the quieter tools of victory. But among the shattered cities and burned-out fields, there was a humbler icon of endurance and unity. It came in a small glass bottle filled with caramel sweetness and bubbling hope. And for countless men and women who lived through those years, it wasn't just Coca-Cola. It was America, cold, fizzy, and unstoppable. The war had ended, but another one had already begun, one without front lines or gunfire, yet no less consuming. The Cold War unfolded not in trenches or beaches, but in hearts, minds, and markets. Where tanks had once rolled, now billboards rose. Where soldiers once fought for freedom, companies began to compete for ideology. And at the heart of this new global battlefield stood a familiar emblem of American spirit, Coca-Cola. When U.S. troops returned home, they brought with them more than medals and scars. They brought the story of Coca-Cola as their faithful companion in the darkest hours of the war. The company had followed them across continents, built factories under shellfire, and delivered hope in glass form. Now, in peacetime, that loyalty transformed into legend. The pause that refreshes wasn't just an advertising slogan anymore. It was the mantra of a nation stepping into an age of power, prosperity, and influence. America emerged from World War II as a superpower, its industries untouched, its economy roaring, its confidence unshakable. Coca-Cola embodied that new confidence. It was bright, simple, and omnipresent, a taste of stability in an uncertain world. In Europe's war-ravaged cities, people queued not for breadlines, but for bottles of Coke. In Asia, where American troops had fought and died, the drink became an exotic miracle, a flavor of the victorious nation. Wherever the American flag appeared, Coca-Cola followed, sometimes even first. But as one empire of freedom grew, another loomed in opposition. Behind the Iron Curtain, the Soviet Union viewed Coca-Cola not as a beverage, but as a symbol of everything it despised: capitalism, Western influence, and the seductive comfort of American life. To Moscow, Coke represented the weaponization of pleasure, the infiltration of ideology through sugar and carbonation. And, in a way, they weren't wrong. In Berlin, the city divided by ideology and concrete, Coca-Cola became more than a drink. It became a declaration. American soldiers stationed in West Berlin drank it openly, proudly, while East German officials denounced it as imperialist sugar water. Yet even in the shadow of the wall, the red and white bottles somehow found their way across. Black market traders smuggled them into the East, selling them for a small fortune. To those who tasted it, Coke wasn't just refreshment, it was rebellion. The company knew its power, and Washington knew it too. The U.S. government quietly encouraged Coca-Cola's expansion into Europe, Asia, and the Middle East, recognizing that no propaganda film or speech could match the persuasive simplicity of sharing a Coke. Each bottle carried with it the subtle message of American abundance, the promise that life could be sweet, democratic, and free. During the late 1940s and early 1950s, Coca-Cola became an unofficial ambassador of American values. In Greece, where civil war raged between communist and royalist forces, American aid ships unloaded not only weapons and food, but also pallets of Coke. In post-war Japan, General Douglas MacArthur allowed Coca-Cola plants to operate under U.S. military supervision, ensuring that the Japanese workforce would associate American presence not only with defeat, but with opportunity. The Coca-Cola logo began to adorn shop signs, movie theaters, and even baseball stadiums rebuilt under U.S. influence. Yet the company's ambitions didn't end with Europe or Asia. As the Cold War expanded, so too did Coca-Cola's reach. In Africa, newly decolonized nations saw in Coca-Cola a symbol of modernity. In Latin America, it became the taste of progress, often replacing local sodas as an emblem of international status. The red label was no longer just American, it had become global, a kind of cultural passport that transcended language and politics. Of course, not everyone welcomed it. France's intellectuals denounced the brand as Coca-colonization, warning that the spread of American soft power would erode traditional culture. Soviet newspapers mocked the West's obsession with the drink, portraying it as a hollow substitute for true human achievement. But mockery couldn't stop the tide. By the 1960s, Coca-Cola was being sold in over 120 countries, its logo recognized by more people than any national flag on Earth. Even within the Kremlin's orbit, Coca-Cola found its way in curious forms. During the late 1940s, when Soviet leader Joseph Stalin requested a soft drink that resembled vodka but tasted like Coke, American officials arranged a discreet solution. A special batch of white Coke was created, colorless, bottled in clear glass, and sealed with a red star instead of the usual logo. It was shipped to Moscow as a diplomatic courtesy, consumed quietly behind the walls of Soviet power. Even the great architects of anti-capitalist ideology couldn't resist the allure of America's most famous flavor. Meanwhile, in the United States, Coca-Cola's executives understood that their product had outgrown the status of a mere beverage. They embraced its mythic power. Advertisements no longer sold thirst, they sold identity. Posters showed smiling families, GIs kissing sweethearts, athletes raising bottles in victory. It wasn't about carbonation, it was about connection. Every sip was a reaffirmation of what it meant to live in the free world. By the time President Kennedy declared that America would put a man on the moon, Coca-Cola was already halfway there, its brand recognition reaching every corner of the globe that had a road, a port, or a radio. When U.S. soldiers went to Korea, Vietnam, and countless other fronts of the Cold War, Coca-Cola went with them. Bottling plants followed bases, advertisements followed aid shipments. Even when protests against American influence erupted abroad, the Coca-Cola sign remained, sometimes defaced, sometimes adored, but always present. It was, in its own way, the most effective non-lethal weapon of the 20th century. No bullet could travel as far as Coca-Cola's message had. No tank could win as many hearts. And no general could command the kind of loyalty that one sip inspired in the millions who tasted it and thought, this is what America feels like. Through the decades of nuclear tension, proxy wars, and ideological propaganda, Coca-Cola never fired a shot. Yet its influence seeped into every border it crossed, every heart it touched. The Soviets had their missiles, their red flags, their parades, but America had its red label, its bubbles, its promise of joy. And so, even as diplomats debated and armies maneuvered, somewhere in a cafe in Berlin, a bar in Tokyo, or a market in Cairo, someone raised a cold glass bottle, watched the fizz rise to the surface, and smiled. The war for the world's future was still raging, but in that brief, effervescent moment, America was winning.